Sometimes a single act of kindness can change everything. When Jackson Cole finds a wounded woman collapsed in the dust, bleeding and barely conscious, he doesn't hesitate to help her. By morning, he learns the truth: she's running from Silas Blackwood's outlaw army, 200 men strong, and they're coming for her. Jackson could leave, disappear into the mountains where no one would find him, but he stays. Something about her reminds him why he became the man he is. Now he stands alone, facing an impossible fight. What makes one man willing to face 200 when he could simply walk away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before the woman arrived, Jackson Cole woke to the sound of silence. Not the kind of silence that makes a man uneasy, but the good kind, the kind that comes from being far enough from civilization that the world feels like it belongs to you alone. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing halfway up the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the mountain wind like old friends keeping watch. He was 42 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older, the kind of lines that come from squinting into too many sunrises, searching horizons for trouble that always seemed to find him anyway. His hands were calloused and strong, scarred from years of work and things he'd rather not remember. Dark hair touched with grey at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 days, and eyes the colour of winter steel eyes that had seen too much but somehow hadn't gone cold. Jackson stepped onto his porch, bare feet against weathered wood, and breathed in the pine-scented air. The morning stretched before him like all the others had for the past 7 years. Coffee first, strong and black. Then tend to the horses, check the trap lines, maybe ride down to Timber Ridge if supplies were running low. It was a simple life, and that simplicity had saved him when nothing else could. The worn leather journal sat on the small table beside his chair, filled with years of thoughts he'd never spoken aloud. Sketches of the mountains, notes about weather patterns, observations about the wildlife that shared his solitude. Sometimes he wrote about the past, but those entries were brief. The past was a weight he'd learned to carry, not examine. He'd been a different man once. Marshal Jackson Cole, they'd called him. 5 years wearing the badge in Silver Creek, a boom town that needed law more than it needed another saloon. He'd been good at it, better than good. Fair but firm, the kind of lawman who gave men a chance to do right but didn't hesitate when they chose wrong. The town respected him. His wife, Catherine, had been proud of him. Their daughter, Emma, thought he hung the moon. That was before the Garrett gang rode through. Jackson pushed the memory away like he always did, focusing instead on the ritual of his morning. He pulled on his boots, checked the Henry rifle that hung above the door, a habit he couldn't break even after 7 years of peace, and stepped out into the clearing. The horses nickered in greeting from the small corral he'd built. 2 of them, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Flint, and a dappled mare he called River. They were good animals, smart and sure-footed in the high country. He'd chosen them carefully, like he chose everything else in his life now, for reliability, not flash. Timber Ridge sat in the valley below, a dot of civilization against the vast Montana wilderness. Population maybe 300 on a busy day, less when winter drove the prospectors and drifters south. It wasn't much of a town, a main street lined with the usual establishments, a scattering of homes, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. But the people were decent, the kind who'd help a neighbor without expecting payment, who understood that out here you survived together or not at all. Doc Henley was one of the good ones. 58 years old, with hands steady enough to remove a bullet and gentle enough to comfort a child. He'd been a surgeon back east before some trouble. He never said what kind brought him west. Now he ran the only medical practice between Silver Creek and Fort Benton, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births. He and Jackson had developed an understanding over the years. Doc never asked about Jackson's past, and Jackson never asked about his. Sheriff Tom Wardell was another matter. young for a sheriff, barely 30, but with good instincts and a genuine desire to keep his town safe. He'd sought Jackson's advice more than once when trouble stirred, and Jackson had given it sparingly, careful not to step back into the life he'd left behind. Tom knew Jackson had been a lawman once. The way a man carries himself never quite changes, no matter how far into the mountains he runs. Jackson spent the morning checking his traplines, finding 2 rabbits and a muskrat, good pelts that would fetch a fair price when he went to town. The work was methodical, requiring attention but not much thought, leaving his mind free to wander the way it always did up here. He thought about the coming winter, whether he'd laid in enough firewood, thought about the leak in the roof he needed to patch before the first snow. Small concerns, manageable problems, the kind he preferred now. By noon, he'd dressed the pelts and hung them to cure. The sun was high and warm, unusual for late September. He ate a simple lunch of dried venison and hardtack, washing it down with water from the creek that ran 50 yards from his cabin. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache, straight from the snowmelt high above. Afternoon brought clouds rolling in from the west, the kind that promised rain by evening. Jackson spent the time repairing tack and oiling his guns, both the Henry rifle and the Colt revolver he carried when he rode to town. The revolver was old but reliable, its grip worn smooth from years of use. It had been his father's once, passed down when the old man died. Jackson kept it clean and ready, though he rarely fired it anymore. As the sun dropped toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jackson sat on his porch with his journal and a cup of coffee. He wrote a few lines about the changing weather, sketched the way the light caught the mountains. His handwriting was neat and precise, the penmanship of a man who'd once filed reports and arrest warrants. The entry from 7 years ago sat near the middle of the journal. He never reread it, but he knew it was there. The day he'd buried Catherine and Emma, the day he'd taken off his badge and left Silver Creek behind. The day he'd decided that if the law couldn't protect the people he loved, then the law wasn't enough. He'd come to the mountains because they didn't care about justice or vengeance or the weight of failure. The mountains just were, eternal and indifferent. And somehow that indifference had given him the space to keep breathing when he wasn't sure he wanted to. But he was still a man who noticed things, still a man whose instincts had been honed by years of watching for trouble. So when he saw the dust rising from the trail to Timber Ridge late that afternoon, something in him stirred a sense that the peace he'd built was about to be tested. He couldn't have known then that the dust marked the beginning of something that would shake the entire territory. Couldn't have known that in 3 days he'd be standing between an innocent woman and certain death, facing odds that would make most men run. All he knew was that the silence he'd grown to love suddenly felt fragile, like a held breath before a storm. Jackson finished his coffee and went inside to clean his rifle. Old habits, he told himself, nothing more than old habits keeping him sharp. But deep down, in a place he rarely examined, he knew better. Some part of him had been waiting for 7 years, waiting for a reason to be the man he used to be, waiting for a chance at the justice that had failed him when he needed it most. The rain started just after dark, pattering against the roof in a steady rhythm that usually lulled him to sleep. But that night, Jackson lay awake listening, his hand resting on the grip of his father's revolver, wondering what the dust on the trail had meant and why he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The ride down to Timber Ridge took just under an hour when the trail was dry. Jackson made it in 45 minutes that morning, pushing Flint harder than usual. He needed coffee, the real stuff from Miller's General Store, not the chicory blend he'd been stretching for the past month. Needed flour and salt, maybe some tobacco if Miller had any that wasn't half dust. Simple errands, the kind that gave structure to a solitary life. The town looked the same as always when he rode in, a handful of horses tied to hitching posts, a wagon being loaded outside the feed store, Mrs. Patterson sweeping the boardwalk in front of her boarding house. Familiar rhythms, comfortable and predictable. He nodded to the faces he recognized, received nods in return. They knew him here not well, but enough. The mountain man who kept to himself but could be counted on in a pinch. He was tying Flint to the rail outside Miller's when he heard the commotion near the church. Raised voices, urgent and frightened. Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, finding the grip of his Colt before his conscious mind registered the movement. 7 years hadn't dulled those reflexes. A woman stumbled into view from the alley between the church and Doc Henley's office. She took 3 steps and collapsed in the dust of the main street like a puppet with cut strings. Jackson was moving before anyone else reacted, his long strides covering the distance in seconds. He dropped to one knee beside her, his experienced eyes taking in details that made his jaw tighten. Blood soaked through the back of her dress, a dark stain that spread from her left shoulder blade. Her face was pale as winter snow, lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, blonde hair matted with sweat and dirt. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hand clutched something, a blood-stained handkerchief, gripped so tightly her knuckles were white, even in unconsciousness. Jackson gently pried her fingers open, revealing embroidered initials, S.M. The fabric was good quality, the kind of thing a woman of means would carry. That detail told him something, though he wasn't sure what yet. "Doc!" Jackson called over his shoulder, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed in emergencies. "Doc Henley, I need you now." The doctor came running, his medical bag already in hand. He took one look at the woman, and his expression went grim. "Get her inside. Carefully, that wound looks deep." Jackson lifted her with practiced ease, surprised by how light she was. Too light, as if she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He carried her into Doc's office, laying her face down on the examination table, as instructed. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind that spoke of shock and blood loss. Doc Henley worked with efficient precision, cutting away the ruined dress to expose the wound. Jackson saw the doc's shoulders tense, a sure sign it was worse than expected. "Bullet wound," Doc confirmed, his voice steady but tight. "Clean through, missed the lung by maybe half an inch. She's lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. This happened at least 2 days ago, maybe 3. Infection starting." "Will she live?" Jackson asked. "If I can get the fever down and keep the wound clean, yes. But she needs rest and care, and she needs to tell me what happened." Doc glanced up at Jackson. "Any idea who she is?" Jackson shook his head, still holding the blood-stained handkerchief. "S.M." He committed the initials to memory, knowing they might be important later. Sheriff Wardell arrived then, breathless from running. "What happened?" "That's what we'd like to know," Doc said, threading a needle to begin stitching. She just appeared and collapsed. Jackson found her. Tom studied the woman's face, his young features creasing with concern and something else, recognition, or maybe just the shadow of it. "I'll ask around, see if anyone knows her." He looked at Jackson. "You staying?" Jackson should have said no, should have collected his supplies and ridden back to his mountain sanctuary. But something about the woman's desperate grip on that handkerchief, about the way she'd collapsed like she'd been running until her body simply gave out, kept him rooted in place. "For now," he said. The hours that followed moved slowly, marked by the woman's fevered breathing and occasional murmurs. Doc worked methodically, cleaning and stitching the wound, forcing water and medicine past her cracked lips. Jackson sat in the corner, watching and waiting, his instincts telling him this was more than a simple robbery gone wrong. It was late afternoon when she began to speak. Not conscious speech, but the fevered ramblings that come when the mind slips between waking and dreaming. Most of it was incoherent fragments of words, pieces of thoughts that didn't connect. But some things came through clear enough to make Jackson's blood run cold. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Can't stop them. 200. Maybe more. They're coming." Doc looked at Jackson, alarm clear in his eyes. Jackson moved closer, leaning down to catch her words. "Who's coming?" he asked gently. "Who are you running from?" Her eyes opened, then bright blue and filled with terror so pure it was painful to see. She focused on Jackson's face with an intensity that suggested she saw him clearly, that for a moment the fever had released its hold. "Blackwood," she breathed. "Silas Blackwood. He'll burn everything, everyone. He always does." Her hand shot out, gripping Jackson's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let him find me. Please. He'll kill you all if he finds me." Then she was gone again, sinking back into fevered unconsciousness, leaving Jackson and Doc staring at each other with a shared understanding of just how serious this was. Sheriff Wardell had been standing in the doorway. His face had gone pale. Did she just say, "Blackwood? Silas Blackwood?" Jackson stood slowly, his mind already working through implications, calculating odds, assessing threats the way he'd been trained to do a lifetime ago. "You know the name?" "Everyone within 500 miles knows that name," Tom said quietly. "He runs the biggest outlaw gang in 3 territories. They say he's got 200 men who'd ride through hell for him. Towns that don't cooperate." He stopped, swallowing hard. "Towns that don't cooperate disappear. Burned to the ground, everyone in them killed, or worse." Doc Henley's hands had gone still on his instruments. "And she's running from him." Jackson looked down at the woman, at her too thin frame, at the desperation that marked her even in unconsciousness, at the silver locket he now noticed around her neck. He reached out and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, faded but still clear. A young woman, this woman standing with an older couple, a family. The kind of photograph people treasure because it captures a moment of happiness that might never come again. "We need to hide her," Jackson said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "When she wakes up, we need to know the full story. But right now, we need to assume Blackwood's men are tracking her, and they could arrive any time." "Where?" Doc asked. "Timber Ridge isn't exactly Fort Knox." Jackson met his eyes. "My cabin. It's defensible, isolated, and unless someone knows exactly where to look, it won't be found." "You'd take that risk?" Tom asked. "If what they say about Blackwood is true." "If what they say is true," Jackson interrupted, "then leaving her here puts the whole town at risk. At least in the mountains, the fight stays away from innocent people." He didn't say the other part, the part that was growing louder in his mind with every passing moment. That looking at her reminded him of Catherine, of Emma, of every person he'd failed to protect when it mattered. That maybe, after 7 years of running from his past, he'd been given a chance to stand for something again. Sheriff Wardell studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you get her there after dark. Less chance of being seen." Doc Henley carefully covered the woman with a clean blanket. "I'll prepare supplies, bandages, medicine, everything you'll need. But Jackson," he paused, his weathered face serious, "if Blackwood really is after her, you're signing up for more than just nursing duty. You understand that?" Jackson looked down at the woman, at the locket still open in his hand, at the family photograph that represented everything she'd lost. He thought about the handkerchief with its embroidered initials, about the bullet wound that had nearly killed her, about the pure terror in her eyes when she'd spoken Blackwood's name. "I understand," he said quietly. And he did. He understood that the peace he'd built in the mountains had just ended, understood that the man he'd been trying to leave behind was about to surface whether he wanted it to or not, understood that sometimes running isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand, even when the odds are impossible, even when standing might cost you everything. The woman stirred again, her lips forming soundless words. Jackson leaned close, catching the whisper that escaped. "Sarah," she breathed. "My name is Sarah." "Sarah Mitchell," Jackson thought, making sense of the initials. He closed the locket gently and stood, his mind already shifting into tactical mode, planning routes and defenses and contingencies. The mountain man was receding, the marshal was returning, and somewhere to the south, If the woman's fevered warnings were true, an army of outlaws was riding north, searching for the person Jackson had just decided to protect. The storm that had been building for 7 years was finally here. Doc Henley arrived at dawn on the 4th day, his medical bag in one hand and a rolled map in the other. His face carried the weight of bad news, and Jackson felt his chest tighten as he watched the old doctor dismount. "It's worse than we thought," Doc said without preamble, spreading the map across Jackson's porch table. "Found this on a dying man 2 towns over. Someone tried to warn the territory, got himself killed for the trouble." The map was hand-drawn but detailed, showing a trail of destruction that stretched across 3 states. Town names were marked in black ink, with dates beside them. Beside each date was a notation: burned, occupied, or destroyed. The pattern was clear and methodical. Blackwood's army moved like locusts, leaving nothing but ash and grief in their wake. 17 towns. In 8 months, Doc said, pointing to the marks. Some of them just disappeared. No survivors, no witnesses. The ones that survived paid tribute money, supplies, whatever Blackwood demanded. Those that refused, he tapped a cluster of marks near the Wyoming border. 3 settlements, population 200 combined. Now they're ghost towns. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of Jackson's old coats against the morning chill. She looked at the map and went pale, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "I came from here," she said, pointing to a mark near Broken Bow. "My family's ranch. There were neighbors, other families. Are they gone?" Doc said gently. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Blackwood doesn't leave loose ends." Jackson studied the map with the tactical mind of his former profession. The pattern told a story. Blackwood wasn't just raiding randomly. He was building something, carving out territory and eliminating anyone who might resist or report his activities. It was organized, systematic, military, almost. "This isn't just banditry," Jackson said. "This is conquest. He's building an empire out here where the law's too thin to stop him." "Which means Sarah's not just a captive he wants back," Doc replied. "She's evidence, living proof of what he does. If word got out that someone escaped him and lived to tell about it, it undermines everything he's built on fear and inevitability." Sarah sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "I've doomed this whole town, everyone who helped me." "You've done nothing but survive," Jackson interrupted firmly. "Blackwood doomed himself the moment he decided fear was an acceptable way to rule. Men like him, they always fall eventually. We just need to make sure he falls before he can hurt anyone else." Doc looked at Jackson with something between hope and skepticism. "One man against an organization this size. Not one man." Jackson straightened, his mind already working through possibilities. "Sheriff Wardell knows what we're up against. There are still good people in Timber Ridge who'll stand when it matters. And I'm betting Blackwood's not as unified as he appears. Men who follow out of fear are one betrayal away from turning." "That's a lot of betting on possibilities," Doc observed. "It's what I've got." Jackson met his eyes. "Unless you're suggesting I hand Sarah over and hope Blackwood's feeling merciful." "You know I'm not suggesting that." Doc closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. "I'm just making sure you understand what you're choosing. Because once Blackwood gets here, there's no taking it back. No riding away. This ends in blood, one way or another." "I know," Jackson said quietly, "and I'm choosing it anyway." After Doc left, Jackson called for an emergency meeting at the cabin with Sheriff Wardell and the few townspeople he trusted most. They arrived separately throughout the morning: Tom Wardell, Doc Henley, old Marcus Webb, who'd fought in the war and still had steady hands with a rifle, young Daniel Foster, who worked at the general store but had the kind of courage that made up for inexperience, and surprisingly, Mrs. Catherine Mills, the schoolteacher whose late husband had been a Texas Ranger. They gathered around Jackson's table, 6 people who would form the core of whatever resistance Timber Ridge could muster. It wasn't much against 200, but it was a start. Jackson spread the map where everyone could see it. This is what we're facing. Not just an outlaw gang, but an organized force that's been operating with impunity for months. They're systematic, ruthless, and experienced. How do we fight something like that? Daniel asked, his youth showing in the tremor of his voice. We don't fight it head-on, Jackson replied. We can't win that battle, but we can make it costly enough that Blackwood decides Sarah isn't worth the price. We need to think like a military unit, facing a superior force. Fortifications, ambush points, supply denial, information control. Marcus Webb, his weathered face creased with thought, leaned forward. You're talking about guerrilla tactics, hit and fade, make them bleed for every inch. Exactly. Blackwood's strength is his numbers and reputation, but numbers mean logistics, food, water, organization, and reputation only works if fear stays stronger than anger. Jackson looked at each face around the table. If we can turn this from a simple retrieval into a costly siege, his men will start questioning whether one woman is worth dying for. What about the town? Catherine Mills asked. We've got families, children. If we resist and lose, then we lose everything anyway, Sheriff Wardell interjected. You think Blackwood's going to forgive Timber Ridge for hiding her, for helping her? He'll make an example of us regardless. At least this way we go down fighting. I won't ask anyone to fight who doesn't choose it freely, Jackson said. And I won't judge anyone who takes their family and leaves. This isn't your fight. It's mine. I brought Sarah here, and I'll face the consequences. It became our fight the moment we decided decent people don't hand over victims to their abusers, Doc Henley said firmly. I've patched up too many women and children who suffered at the hands of men like Blackwood. If there's a chance to stop one of them, I'm taking it. The others nodded in agreement, and Jackson felt something shift in his chest. He'd been alone for 7 years, trusting only himself, believing that isolation was the only way to avoid failing the people around him. But these people were choosing to stand with him, not because they were foolish or didn't understand the risk, but because they understood exactly what was at stake and decided it mattered more than their fear. All right then, Jackson said. Here's what we do. Tom, you start quietly identifying everyone in town who can shoot and might be willing to help. Don't pressure anyone, just gather information. Marcus, you and I will scout defensive positions, high ground, choke points, anything we can use to multiply our force. Catherine, you organize evacuation routes for families who want to leave and safe rooms for those who stay. Daniel, I need you to inventory every weapon, every box of ammunition, every supply we might need. Doc, you prepare a field hospital. If we do this right, we'll need it. And what about her? Marcus nodded toward Sarah, who had been sitting quietly throughout the discussion. No offense, miss, but she's what they're coming for. What's her role in this? Sarah stood, her shoulders squared despite the lingering weakness from her wound. I can shoot now. Not well yet, but good enough. And I know how Blackwood thinks, how his men operate. I lived with them for 8 months. That knowledge could be valuable. Jackson saw the determination in her eyes and felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. He wanted to protect her, to keep her safe and far from the coming violence. But he also respected her need to reclaim agency over her life, to be more than just a victim waiting to be saved. Sarah will be positioned in the church tower, Jackson decided. Good sightlines, defensible, and if things go wrong, she can use the bell tower to escape into the woods. She observes and reports, only engages if necessary. Sarah nodded, accepting the compromise between safety and participation. They spent the rest of the day planning. Jackson's cabin became a command center, the map covered with marks and notes as they identified every advantage and vulnerability. The mountain terrain offered natural choke points. The town's layout, while not ideal, could be modified with barricades and firing positions. Supply lines could be disrupted if they moved quickly enough. It wasn't a perfect plan, Against 200 experienced fighters, it might not even be a good plan, but it was a plan, and it gave them something to work toward, a sense of purpose that beat waiting passively for destruction. As evening fell and the others prepared to leave, Sheriff Wardell pulled Jackson aside. "You know this is probably suicide, right? Even with preparation, even with people willing to fight." "I know," Jackson said, "but doing nothing is definitely suicide. At least this way, we die on our feet." Tom studied him for a moment, then held out his hand. "It's been an honor knowing you, Jackson Cole. In case we don't get another chance to say it." Jackson shook his hand firmly. "The honor's mine, Tom. You're a good man and a good sheriff, better than I ever was." After everyone left, Jackson and Sarah stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains one more time. The peaceful beauty of the landscape seemed almost obscene given what was coming, but Jackson found himself grateful for it anyway. Some things remained good, even when the world went to hell. "Do you think we can win?" Sarah asked quietly. Jackson considered lying, offering false hope to ease her fear, but she deserved better than that. "I think we can make them regret coming for you. I think we can show that even in places where law doesn't reach, there are still people willing to stand for what's right. And I think, win or lose, we'll face it together. That's something." Sarah slipped her hand into his, and they stood that way. As darkness fell, two broken people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other, and in the principle that some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter the cost. The storm was closer now. Jackson could feel it in the air, in the tension that had settled over the valley like a held breath. Tomorrow they would start fortifying. Tomorrow they would prepare for war. But tonight they had peace, and they had each other. And for now that was enough. They found Blackwood's calling card at dawn. The black leather glove hung from the town's welcome sign, impaled on a nail like a trophy. Beside it, a note written in bold, aggressive strokes: "Return what is mine by sunrise tomorrow, or bury your dead by sunset." Sheriff Wardell had been making his morning rounds when he discovered it. He brought it to Jackson's cabin without touching the glove itself, as if Blackwood's evil might be contagious. Sarah stared at the glove with the kind of recognition that comes from intimate fear. He wore those every day, black leather, custom-made. He said they made him look like the devil. Her voice was flat, emotionless. He was right. Jackson studied the note, analyzing the handwriting for clues about the man he'd soon face. The letters were large, confident, aggressive. The kind of writing that came from someone who'd never been truly challenged, who'd grown accustomed to the world bending to his will. "He thinks this is already over," Jackson observed. "Thinks we'll fold at the first real threat." "Most towns do," Sheriff Wardell said quietly. "That's why he keeps winning." The ultimatum changed everything. What had been an abstract threat, something they could prepare for in theory, was now concrete and immediate. Sunrise tomorrow meant they had perhaps 30 hours before Blackwood's army descended on Timber Ridge in full force. The town reacted as humans do when faced with impossible choices, some with courage, some with fear, and most with a complicated mixture of both. By midday, 3 families had packed wagons and left, heading east toward Fort Benton. Jackson watched them go without judgment. They had children to protect, lives to preserve. He couldn't fault them for choosing survival. But others surprised him. Marcus Webb's 2 sons arrived from their homesteads, both carrying rifles and grim determination. Mrs. Mills organized the remaining women into support roles, loading ammunition, preparing medical supplies, coordinating food stores. Young Daniel Foster revealed he'd been practicing with his father's old service revolver and could hit a target at 50 yards more often than not. By evening, Jackson counted 43 people willing to stand. 43 against 200. The odds were still suicidal, but they were better than 1. Sarah watched the preparations from Jackson's porch, her expression caught between gratitude and guilt. "They're going to die because of me," she said when Jackson joined her. They're going to fight because of themselves, Jackson corrected. Because they decided some things are worth the risk. You're just the catalyst that made them remember it. That's a pretty way of saying I brought death to their doorstep. Jackson turned to face her fully. You know what Blackwood would do if we handed you over? Kill me, probably. After making an example of me. Yes. And then what? Think he'd just leave Timber Ridge alone? After we harbored you, hid you, delayed him? Jackson shook his head. Men like Blackwood don't forgive. They punish. Whether we give you up or not, he was always going to burn this town. At least this way we face him with our dignity intact. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You really believe that? I know it. Jackson's voice carried the certainty of hard experience. I've dealt with men like him before. The Garrett gang that killed my family, they didn't just rob and run. They destroyed because destruction fed their sense of power. Blackwood's the same, just operating on a larger scale. The only difference between appeasement and resistance is whether we die on our knees or our feet. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jackson made final adjustments to their defensive plan. The church tower was reinforced with sandbags and supplied with ammunition. Rifle positions were established at key points throughout town. Barricades were constructed from wagons, lumber, anything that might slow an advancing force. Doc Henley transformed the church basement into a field hospital, laying out instruments and supplies with the calm efficiency of a man who'd seen too many wars. Catherine Mills established an evacuation route through the back of the schoolhouse, leading to a creek bed that could hide civilians if the town fell. Jackson moved through it all like the marshal he'd once been, checking positions, offering tactical advice, boosting morale with a calm confidence he didn't entirely feel. But beneath the exterior, his mind was racing through scenarios and contingencies, calculating odds and acceptable losses. That evening, he sat alone in his cabin with his journal open before him. The pages were filled with 7 years of mountain observations and solitary thoughts. Now, he wrote what might be his final entry. If I fall tomorrow, whoever finds this should know something. I chose this, not because I was looking to die, but because I was looking for something worth living for. 7 years I spent running from the fact that I couldn't save my family. 7 years thinking the best way to protect people was to stay away from them. Sarah Mitchell changed that. Not because she needed saving, though she did, but because she reminded me that some fights find you whether you're looking for them or not. And when they do, running doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone. I loved my wife and daughter more than my own life. Their deaths nearly destroyed me. But maybe that's not how I should remember them. Maybe I should remember that they loved a man who stood for something, who believed in justice and protection and the idea that good people don't turn their backs on evil just because it's easier. If I die tomorrow, I die trying to be that man again. And if I live well, then maybe I've earned the right to stop running from my own past. He closed the journal and set it aside, then reached for his father's pocket watch. The gold case was tarnished with age, but the mechanism still kept perfect time. Jackson wound it carefully, feeling the familiar resistance of the spring, hearing the soft tick that had marked his father's life and now marked his own. His father had been a good man, not a lawman, just a rancher who believed in honest work and fair dealing. But he'd taught Jackson something important, that the measure of a man wasn't his success or failure, but whether he faced his challenges with integrity. Tomorrow Jackson would face the biggest challenge of his life. Not just Blackwood's army, but his own doubt, his own fear, his own lingering belief that he wasn't enough to protect the people who counted on him. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of his blankets against the cool evening air. "Can't sleep? Too much to think about," Jackson admitted. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be hard. Tomorrow will be impossible," she corrected, moving to sit beside him. "But I'm done running from impossible things." She looked at the watch in his hands. "That was your father's?" "Yes. He gave it to me the day I left to become a marshal. Said it would remind me that time matters not how much you have, but what you do with it. Jackson snapped the case closed and slipped the watch into his vest pocket. I think he'd understand why I'm doing this. My father would understand too, Sarah said softly. He always said that character shows in the hard moments, when it's easier to look away than to stand up. Her hand found Jackson's. I'm glad you didn't look away. I'm glad you survived long enough to be saved, Jackson replied. They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely. Tomorrow would bring violence and chaos, and quite possibly death. But tonight they had each other, and they had purpose, and they had the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you've chosen the right path even when it's the hardest one. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Jackson's vest, marking the passage of seconds toward an uncertain dawn. And in the distance, though neither of them could see it yet, 200 riders were making camp for the night, confident that tomorrow would bring easy victory. They were about to learn that some fights aren't as easy as they look, and some people, when pushed far enough, push back with everything they have. The watch kept ticking, the night kept deepening, and Timber Ridge prepared to make its stand. The rider came 2 hours before midnight, approaching under a white flag fashioned from what looked like a torn shirt. Sheriff Wardell spotted him first from his position at the edge of town and called for Jackson. Jackson arrived with his rifle ready, though he kept it lowered in recognition of the truce flag. The rider was older than he expected, somewhere in his 50s, with grey streaking his dark hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, but his expression carried something Jackson hadn't expected to see in one of Blackwood's men. Shame. "Name's Marcus Webb," the rider said, then caught himself. "No, not that Marcus. Marcus Cole. I'm looking for Jackson Cole. Been told he's in this town." Jackson felt the world shift beneath him. Cole was his mother's maiden name, but he'd never heard of any Marcus in her family. "I'm Jackson Cole. State your business." The rider's eyes widened with something like recognition mixed with grief. "You look like your father. Same eyes, same set to your jaw. Thomas Cole was my partner once, 30 years back, before everything went wrong. My father was a rancher," Jackson said carefully, his mind racing through implications. "Never mentioned having a partner in anything, because I made him promise never to speak of me." Marcus dismounted slowly, hands visible and away from his weapons. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear, but you need to know it before tomorrow comes." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a faded photograph, handling it like it was made of glass. When he handed it to Jackson, the image showed 2 young men standing beside a creek, arms around each other's shoulders. One was unmistakably Jackson's father, younger, but with the same honest features Jackson remembered. The other was Marcus, decades younger but clearly the same man. "That was taken in 1845, Marcus said. "Your father and I were prospecting partners. Found a significant gold deposit up in the Bitterroot Range, not far from where your cabin sits now. We agreed to keep it secret until we could file the proper claims." His voice dropped. "There was a third partner, Silas Blackwood." Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're lying." "I wish I was." Marcus's face was lined with old pain. Silas was different then, ambitious, maybe a little ruthless, but not evil. Not yet. We worked that claim together for 2 years, pulling out enough gold to make us all wealthy. Then Silas got impatient, wanted to sell the claim to a big mining outfit, take the money and run. Your father and I said no, we wanted to work it properly, build something lasting. And then what? Jackson's voice was hard. And then Silas decided if we wouldn't cooperate, he'd eliminate us, made it look like a random outlaw attack on your father. I was supposed to be there too, but I got delayed in town. By the time I arrived, Marcus's voice broke. Tom was dead, shot in the back, and Silas was gone, with all the maps and documents proving our claim. The world seemed to tilt. Jackson's father had died when Jackson was 15, killed by what the local sheriff had called a robbery gone wrong. Jackson had always believed it was random violence, the kind of senseless tragedy that plagued the frontier. But this, you're saying Blackwood killed my father for gold, that the outlaws who murdered him were Blackwood's men. I'm saying Blackwood personally shot your father in the back and left him to die like a dog. Marcus's voice shook with suppressed rage. Then he disappeared. I spent 5 years looking for him, but he'd vanished into the territories. When I finally found him again, he'd built an army and a reputation so fearsome that coming after him would have been suicide. So I joined him instead. You joined the man who killed your partner? Jackson couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. I joined him to stay alive, long enough to find the right moment to destroy him, Marcus corrected. And because my daughter was still alive, and I couldn't risk her if I went after him directly. Silas knew about her, used her as insurance that I'd stay loyal and keep my mouth shut about the past. Jackson's mind was reeling, trying to process revelations that recontextualized his entire life. The tragedy that had shaped him, that had driven him to become a marshal, that had ultimately led to his own family's deaths, all of it traced back to Silas Blackwood. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Marcus met his eyes with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Because tomorrow Silas comes for that girl you're protecting, and when he does, I'm going to help you kill him. I've waited 30 years for this. My daughter finally escaped him 3 months ago. She's safe in California now, using a new name. I'm the only loose end he has left from the old days, and I'm done pretending to be loyal to the man who destroyed my life." He pulled another item from his saddlebag, a worn leather journal similar to Jackson's own. "This belonged to your father. I saved it from his cabin after he was killed. It has everything, all the details about our partnership, the gold claim, Silas's plans, proof of what he did." Jackson took the journal with trembling hands. His father's handwriting covered the pages, entries dating back 3 decades. He flipped to the final entry, dated 2 days before his father's death. "S. is getting dangerous. Marcus and I agreed to dissolve the partnership if he doesn't settle down. The gold isn't worth what he's becoming. If something happens to me, I want Jackson to know the truth. This land is ours by right, and no amount of threat or violence changes that." The words blurred as emotion threatened to overwhelm Jackson. All these years, he'd carried his father's death as a random tragedy. But it hadn't been random at all. It had been murder, calculated and cold, by the same man who now threatened everything Jackson was trying to protect. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "The Garrett gang that killed your wife and daughter, they were doing contract work for Silas. He'd heard you were a marshal in Silver Creek, remembered the name Cole, and wanted to make sure no one from your father's family could ever come looking for revenge. It wasn't random, Jackson. It was Silas tying up loose ends." The rage that flooded through Jackson was so pure and consuming that for a moment he couldn't speak. Everything, every loss, every tragedy, every reason he'd run to the mountains, all of it led back to one man. Silas Blackwood had destroyed his father, his wife, his daughter, and very nearly Jackson himself. "Why should I believe you?" Jackson finally managed. "You could be lying to create chaos in his ranks." Marcus pulled one final item from his coat, a small daguerreotype in a silver frame. It showed a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes. "This is my daughter, Elizabeth. Silas held her for 15 years, same as he's holding Sarah Mitchell now. Same as he's held dozens of others. I've helped him commit terrible crimes because I was a coward who valued my daughter's life over justice. But she's free now, and I'm done being a coward." He met Jackson's eyes with an intensity that spoke of absolute truth. "Tomorrow I ride with his army, but when the fighting starts, I'll turn on them. I'll create confusion in their ranks, feed you information, do everything I can to help you bring him down. All I ask is that if I die doing it, you make sure Elizabeth knows I tried to do right at the end." Jackson studied the older man, this stranger who shared a painful history with his father, who'd lived decades under the shadow of a monster, who was now offering to risk everything for a chance at redemption. Every instinct told him to trust his own assessment, but his gut said Marcus was telling the truth. The pain in his eyes was too real to be fabricated. "What can you tell me about their tactics?" Jackson asked, making his decision. Relief washed over Marcus's face. "Everything. Silas is arrogant, thinks his reputation and numbers make him invincible. He'll come straight up the main approach with overwhelming force, expecting you to break immediately. But his men, most of them are followers, not believers. They're with him for profit and protection, not loyalty. Create enough chaos, make it costly enough, and they'll break." They spent the next hour going over details, weak points in Blackwood's organization, officers who could be turned or eliminated to create confusion, supply vulnerabilities, tactical patterns. Marcus had decades of inside knowledge, and he shared it all with the methodical precision of a man who'd been planning this betrayal for years. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as he prepared to leave. "The gold claim your father died for, it's still valid. The documents Silas stole are in his saddlebag. He keeps them as trophies, reminders of his first big win. If you kill him, that land is rightfully yours. It's worth a fortune." "I don't care about gold," Jackson said. "Your father would want you to have it, to build something good from all this death." Marcus mounted his horse, the white flag still attached to his saddle. "Tomorrow, when the fighting starts, I'll be near Silas. Watch for my signal, I'll drop my hat. That means I'm making my move." "Why risk telling me all this?" Jackson asked. "Why not just make your play tomorrow without warning me?" Marcus looked down at him, and in his eyes Jackson saw the reflection of his own grief and rage and desperate need for redemption. "Because you're Tom Cole's son, because you deserve to know why your life was destroyed. And because when I face Silas Blackwood tomorrow, I want him to know that the past finally caught up to him, that the families he destroyed found each other and brought him down together." After Marcus rode away, Jackson stood in the darkness for a long time, his father's journal clutched in his hands. Sarah found him there an hour later, still trying to process the weight of what he'd learned. "What happened?" she asked, seeing the devastation on his face. Jackson told her everything. About his father's murder, about the gold claim, about Marcus's revelation that even his family's deaths hadn't been random but calculated. Sarah listened without interruption, her hand finding his and holding tight. "I'm so sorry," she whispered when he finished. "This whole time, I thought it was about me. But it's so much bigger." "It was always about you," Jackson corrected. "You're the catalyst. The rest is just—" He struggled for words. "Context, motivation, the reasons why this fight matters beyond the immediate moment. What will you do?" Jackson looked down at his father's journal, then at the pocket watch that had once belonged to the man Blackwood murdered. Slowly, deliberately, he pinned his old marshal's badge to his vest, feeling its weight settle against his chest like a promise being kept. "Tomorrow I'm going to do what I should have done 7 years ago," he said quietly. "I'm going to stand for something. And when Silas Blackwood comes for you, he's going to find out that some debts get paid eventually, that some families don't forget, and that the man he tried to destroy is still standing." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We're still standing," she corrected. Jackson looked at her, this brave woman who'd survived months of captivity and still had the strength to fight, and felt something shift inside him. The rage was still there, hot and sharp, but alongside it was purpose, clarity, the understanding that tomorrow wasn't just about revenge, but about justice, about standing between evil and the innocent, about being the man his father would have been proud of. "Yes," he agreed, "we're still standing, and tomorrow we're going to show Blackwood what that means." The night deepened around them, heavy with the weight of approaching violence. But Jackson felt clearer than he had in years. The enemy had a face now, the fight had meaning, and whatever happened tomorrow, He would face it as Marshal Jackson Cole, son of Thomas Cole, husband of Catherine, father of Emma, protector of Sarah Mitchell, and the last obstacle standing between Silas Blackwood and the empire of fear he'd built on murdered families. The pocket watch ticked steadily. The journal sat heavy in Jackson's hands, and somewhere in the darkness an army approached, unaware that the man they were coming to destroy had just learned exactly why he couldn't afford to lose. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Jackson stood on his cabin porch, his father's pocket watch open in his hand, watching the second hand make its deliberate circuit. He'd wound it just before first light, the familiar ritual grounding him in the present moment, even as his mind raced through final preparations. The watch had marked time through his father's life, through Jackson's own rise and fall as a marshal, through 7 years of self-imposed exile. Now it would mark the minutes until everything came to a head. Jackson snapped the case closed and slipped it into his vest pocket, feeling its weight settle against his heart like a talisman. Sarah emerged from the cabin, already dressed in the practical clothing they'd modified for her dark wool pants, a sturdy shirt, her hair tied back in a severe bun that kept it out of her eyes. She looked different than the broken woman who'd collapsed in Timber Ridge's dust, stronger, harder, ready. "How do you feel?" Jackson asked. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also I don't know how to describe it. Like I've been running so long that standing still feels strange." "That's good," Jackson said. "Fear keeps you sharp. It's the people who aren't afraid who get themselves killed." They ate a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack, neither speaking much. There wasn't much left to say. Everything that mattered had been said in the quiet hours of preparation, in the looks exchanged across the cabin, in the growing certainty that whatever happened today, they would face it together. By the time they rode down to Timber Ridge, the town had transformed. Barricades lined the main street. Windows were shuttered and reinforced. Rifle positions were manned by grim-faced men and women who'd chosen to stand. The church tower bristled with sandbags, its bell waiting to sound the alarm. Doc Henley met them at his office, now converted into a field hospital. His instruments were laid out with surgical precision, bandages stacked in neat piles, everything ready for the wounded that would inevitably come. "Supplies are distributed," Doc reported. "Everyone knows their position and fallback points. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Sheriff Wardell joined them, his young face set in lines of determination that aged him a decade. "Scouts report dust on the southern horizon. They'll be here within 2 hours." 2 hours. Jackson felt time compress, every second suddenly precious. He made a final tour of the defenses, checking each position, offering quiet words of encouragement to people who looked to him for confidence they weren't sure they felt themselves. Marcus Webb's eldest son held the position at the general store, his rifle clean and ready. "My father would be proud of you," Jackson told him, meaning the mountain Marcus, not the traitor riding with Blackwood. "He said you were a good man," the son replied. "Said if you were leading this fight, we had a chance." Jackson hoped he was right. The younger Marcus didn't know yet about his namesake riding with the enemy, didn't know about the complex web of betrayal and loyalty that connected their families. He would learn soon enough. Catherine Mills had positioned herself at the schoolhouse with 3 other women, all armed with rifles. She met Jackson's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. "I taught these children," she said, gesturing to the empty schoolroom. "Every one of them knows their letters, because I gave them that gift. If I die today making sure they don't grow up in Blackwood's world, then I've done my duty." "You're a remarkable woman," Jackson said. "I'm a practical one. Teaching requires discipline and courage. So does this." She checked her rifle with practiced efficiency. "Besides, my husband was a ranger. He'd haunt me if I didn't make his death count for something." Young Daniel Foster manned the church entrance, positioned to protect the stairs leading to Sarah's tower position. He looked nervous but determined, his father's revolver holstered at his hip and a Winchester across his lap. "I'm scared," he admitted when Jackson checked on him. "Good," Jackson replied. "Means you're paying attention. Just remember your training. Breathe, aim, fire, and if things get overwhelming, fall back to the next position. Don't be a hero, be smart." Jackson climbed the tower stairs to find Sarah already in position, her borrowed rifle resting on the sandbags. From here, she had a commanding view of the main approaches to town. The mountains rose behind them, offering escape routes if needed, but also blocking reinforcement from that direction. "This is it," Sarah said quietly. Jackson stood beside her, looking out at the peaceful valley that would soon become a battlefield, having second thoughts. "No." Her voice was firm. "For 8 months I was helpless. For 3 days I ran. Today I fight. Whatever happens, at least I fought." Jackson pulled the marshal's badge from his pocket and pinned it to his vest, where it caught the morning light. The metal felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with responsibility and promise. Sarah watched him do it, understanding the significance. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I hope so." Jackson adjusted the badge, feeling its weight settle. "He taught me that standing up to bullies was worth the risk. Guess I'm about to test that lesson." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the dust cloud on the horizon grow closer. Jackson could make out individual riders now, a dark mass moving with the inexorable certainty of a flood. 200 men, all committed to violence, all certain of victory. But Jackson had fought long odds before, had faced men who thought they were invincible. The key was making them believe they'd miscalculated, that the easy victory they expected was going to cost more than they were willing to pay. His mind ran through the plan one final time. Let them approach, let them get confident, then hit them with everything: the prepared defenses, the strategic advantages of terrain and fortification, and most importantly, Marcus's betrayal from within. Create chaos, make them question, force Blackwood to realize this wasn't going to be simple. "Promise me something," Sarah said suddenly. "If it goes wrong, if they're going to take me—" "They won't," Jackson interrupted. "But if they do—" She turned to face him fully. "Promise me you won't let them take me alive. I can't go back to that. I won't." Jackson met her eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there. She wasn't being dramatic or desperate. She was stating a fact that she would die before returning to captivity, and she was asking him to help her honor that choice, if it came to it. "I promise," he said quietly. "But it won't come to that. I'll die first." "That's what I'm afraid of." Sarah touched his face gently. "You've given me back my life, given me a reason to believe decent people still exist. Whatever happens today, thank you for that." Before Jackson could respond, the church bell began to toll 3 measured strikes. The signal. They were here. Jackson descended the tower, stairs 2 at a time, emerging onto the street as Blackwood's army came into view. They filled the southern approach like a dark tide, riders spread across the entire width of the valley. At their head rode a man in black, unmistakably Silas Blackwood himself, sitting his horse like a king, surveying conquered territory. The army stopped just outside rifle range, a dark mass of men and horses, waiting with the patience of predators. Jackson could feel their confidence from here, the certainty that this would be quick and easy. Just another town too frightened to resist properly. Blackwood himself rode forward alone, stopping in the middle of the street, 50 yards from the nearest barricade. He was younger than Jackson expected, perhaps 50, with dark hair graying at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty that marked every feature. He sat his horse with easy grace, a man completely comfortable with his own power. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "A woman, blonde, about 25, answers to Sarah Mitchell. She's here. I know she's here. Send her out, and I'll let you live." Simple as that. Jackson stepped into view, the marshal's badge catching sunlight. "She's under my protection. You want her, you go through me." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, studying Jackson with the intensity of a man assessing a threat. Then he laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. "One man, one marshal playing hero. You think that's enough?" "I think you're about to find out," Jackson replied calmly. "You know who I am, what I've done to towns that defied me. I know exactly who you are, Silas." Jackson put deliberate emphasis on the first name. "I know you murdered your partner for gold 30 years ago. I know you've built an empire on fear and death. And I know you killed my father, Thomas Cole, because he wouldn't let you steal what wasn't yours." The effect was immediate and satisfying. Blackwood's confidence fractured for just a moment, his eyes widening with genuine surprise. "Cole," he breathed. "You're Tom Cole's son." "I am. And today's the day you answer for what you did to him, and to my family, and to every innocent person you've destroyed, building your little kingdom of fear." Blackwood recovered quickly, but Jackson had seen the crack in his armor. The man wasn't invincible. He could be shaken, and more importantly, his men had seen their leader surprised, a tiny seed of doubt planted in fertile ground. "Touching," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A son avenging his father. Very dramatic, but it doesn't change anything. You're one man with a badge and a grudge. I have 200. The math's simple." "Is it?" Jackson gestured toward the town behind him. "You see these fortifications, these positions? You think we don't have riflemen behind every window, every barrier? You think we're going to just stand here and let you ride in?" He let that sink in, then added the twist. "And you might want to ask yourself who you can trust in that army of yours. Who might be tired of following a murderer? Who might have their own reasons for wanting you dead?" He watched Blackwood's eyes flicker toward his men, just for a second. The seed grew a little larger. "Last chance," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Give me the girl. Walk away. Live." "No," Jackson said simply. Blackwood stared at him for a long moment, then turned his horse back toward his army. "So be it. When you're dying, remember you chose this." He raised his hand, preparing to signal the attack. Jackson's own hand moved to his rifle, ready for what came next. Behind him, 43 people held their positions, their weapons trained on an army they couldn't hope to defeat in open battle. But they weren't planning an open battle. They were planning chaos. Blackwood's hand dropped. The army surged forward, and Jackson Cole, marshal and son and protector, stood his ground as the storm broke over Timber Ridge. Blackwood's fury was palpable even from a distance. He'd lost control of the narrative, lost men to betrayal and resistance, and worst of all, lost the appearance of invincibility. Now he was determined to crush Timber Ridge completely, to make an example so brutal that no one would ever dare resist him again. The third wave was everything he had left, over 100 riders in a coordinated assault, designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. They came from every direction simultaneously, setting fire to buildings on the outskirts to create smoke and confusion, driving straight for the heart of town, where Jackson's defenses were strongest. Jackson fell back to the church, rallying his people for what would be the final stand. They'd taken casualties, Marcus Webb's youngest son dead, Catherine Mills wounded but still fighting, Daniel Foster bleeding from a scalp wound, but refusing to abandon his position. But they'd hurt Blackwood too, hurt him badly enough that his army was fracturing. The battle became chaos. Smoke from burning buildings obscured sightlines. The crack of rifles and the screams of wounded horses filled the air. Jackson found himself fighting hand to hand against 3 riders who'd breached the defenses, his revolver empty and his father's pocket watch falling from his pocket to lie in the dust. He picked up a fallen rifle and used it like a club, connecting with one rider's jaw. Sheriff Wardell appeared beside him, firing his revolver until it clicked empty, then drawing his knife. They fought back to back, 2 lawmen holding a line against overwhelming numbers. Then Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, shouting from the tower, "He's coming!" Blackwood's coming for the church. Jackson looked up to see Blackwood himself riding hard for the church entrance, his black coat billowing behind him like wings. He'd abandoned his army to their fight and was making directly for the one thing he wanted, Sarah. If he could get her, he could claim victory and withdraw. Without her, this whole battle was pointless. Jackson ran, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. He reached the church entrance just as Blackwood dismounted, the engraved revolver already in his hand. They faced each other across 10 feet of bloodied ground, the killer and the son, separated by 30 years and a dozen tragedies. "You should have run when you had the chance," Blackwood said. His face was spattered with blood, his eyes wild with rage and determination. "Funny," Jackson replied. "I was thinking the same about you." They both drew. Jackson's Colt cleared leather a heartbeat faster, but Blackwood was already moving. The shots came simultaneously, Jackson's burning past Blackwood's shoulder, Blackwood's catching Jackson in the ribs and spinning him sideways. Jackson went down hard, his revolver skittering away across the wooden boards. Blackwood advanced, his engraved revolver, the same gun that had killed Jackson's father, aimed at Jackson's head. Thomas Cole begged before he died. "Will you?" Jackson's hand found something in the dust beside him. His father's pocket watch, fallen and open, its glass cracked, but its mechanism still ticking steadily. He wrapped his fingers around it, feeling its weight, remembering everything it represented. "My father didn't beg," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs. "He died knowing his son would finish what he started." Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger. Then a rifle cracked from the tower, and Blackwood staggered, hit in the shoulder. Sarah's shot hadn't killed him, but it had bought Jackson the seconds he needed. Jackson lunged, using his last reserves of strength to tackle Blackwood around the waist. They went down together, grappling for the engraved revolver. Blackwood was younger, stronger, but Jackson had something more powerful, driving him the faces of everyone this man had destroyed. Catherine, Emma, his father, Sarah. All the innocents across 3 territories who'd suffered under Blackwood's reign of terror. The revolver fired between them, the muzzle flash burning Jackson's coat. He felt the bullet graze his arm, but ignored the pain, focusing everything on wresting the gun away. They rolled across the ground, each fighting for the weapon that would determine the outcome. Then Jackson's hand closed over the grip, his finger finding the trigger. He shoved the barrel under Blackwood's chin and looked into the eyes of his father's killer. "This is for Thomas Cole," Jackson said, "and for everyone else whose life you destroyed." He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the battlefield like a thunderclap. Blackwood's body went limp, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Jackson pushed himself off the corpse, his ribs screaming, his arm bleeding, but alive. Around him, the battle was ending. Blackwood's army, seeing their leader fall, lost what remained of their will to fight. Some fled, others threw down their weapons and surrendered. A few tried to rally, but Sheriff Wardell and the remaining defenders made quick work of them. Sarah descended from the tower, picking her way through the smoke and carnage. She found Jackson sitting against the church wall, clutching his bleeding ribs, the engraved revolver still in his hand. She knelt beside him, her eyes searching his face. "Is it over?" she asked. Jackson looked at Blackwood's body, then at the sunrise beginning to break through the smoke. "It's over." She took the revolver from his hand and set it aside, then helped him stand. Around them, Timber Ridge began to count its costs and tend its wounded. But they had survived. Against impossible odds, they had stood and fought and won. The pocket watch lay in the dust where it had fallen, still ticking, still marking time. Jackson picked it up carefully, wiping the blood and dirt from its face. The glass was cracked, but the mechanism ran true. Some things, he thought, are stronger than the violence that tries to break them. 2 weeks after the battle, Jackson stood at the edge of town watching workers raise a new sign. The old one had burned during the fight, just one casualty among many. But Catherine Mills had insisted they needed something to mark what had happened here. something that would remind people of the stand they'd made. The sign read, "Timber Ridge, where good people stand." Simple words, but they carried weight. Already the story was spreading across the territories. How one small town had faced down Blackwood's army and won. How ordinary people had chosen courage over fear. The legend would grow in the telling, Jackson knew, but the core truth would remain. His ribs still ached where Blackwood's bullet had cracked them. Doc Henley had patched him up well, but healing took time. The scar would be permanent, a reminder of the price of standing. But Jackson found he didn't mind. Some scars were worth carrying. Sarah sat beside him on the bench, her own wounds healing. The bullet wound in her shoulder had reopened during the fight, and she'd lost enough blood to worry Doc considerably. But she'd survived, stronger for having fought instead of just endured. "Federal marshals arrived this morning," she said. "They're taking custody of the prisoners." There had been 37 survivors from Blackwood's army willing to surrender. Some would hang for their crimes, others would serve long sentences. A few of the younger ones, pressed into service and more victims than villains, might eventually be released. Justice would be imperfect, but it would be served. "Did they find the documents?" Jackson asked. "The ones Marcus mentioned?" Sarah nodded. "In Blackwood's saddlebag, just like he said. Your father's partnership agreement, the gold claim, everything. The marshals confirmed it that land is legally yours now. The gold, too." Jackson had visited his father's grave the day after the battle, once he could walk without help. He'd placed the cracked pocket watch on the headstone and told his father everything that had happened, about Sarah, about Marcus's betrayal and redemption, about standing when running would have been easier. He'd wept then, finally allowing himself to grieve not just his father, but everyone he'd lost along the way. Catherine and Emma. 7 years of isolation, the marshal he'd been, and the mountain man he'd become. All of it flowing out in that quiet cemetery, while Sarah waited respectfully at a distance. When he was done, he'd retrieved the pocket watch and wound it carefully. Then he'd returned to town and begun the work of rebuilding. "What will you do with it?" Sarah asked now. "The claim?" Jackson had thought about that question constantly over the past 2 weeks. The gold represented wealth beyond anything he'd imagined, security, options, a new beginning built on his father's legacy. "I'm going to develop it properly," he decided. "Hire workers, pay fair wages, do it the way my father wanted. The way Thomas Cole would have approved of." He looked at Sarah. "There's a condition, though." "Oh?" "I'm going to need help. Someone I trust to keep the operation honest. Someone who understands what it means to fight for something worth having." He met her eyes. "Interested in being a partner?" Sarah's smile was the first genuine one Jackson had seen from her, lighting her face and erasing years of trauma. "Are you offering me a job or something more?" "I'm offering you a choice," Jackson said carefully. "You're free now, truly free. You can go anywhere, be anyone. If you want to stay, there's a place for you here in the business, in this town, in—" he paused, uncertain how to continue. "In your life?" Sarah finished softly. "Yes," Jackson admitted, "if you want that. But only if you want it. You've spent too long being told what to do, who to be. I won't add to that." Sarah took his hand, the gesture natural now after 2 weeks of sitting together while they healed, of sharing the quiet moments that came after violence. "I spent 8 months as someone's property, 3 days running from my past, and 2 weeks learning what it feels like to stand beside someone who sees me as an equal. I think I'd like to keep doing that, if the offer's genuine." "It's genuine," Jackson assured her, "though I should warn you I'm still learning how to be a person again. 7 years alone doesn't make for good social skills." "Good thing I'm patient, then." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Besides, we have time. That's what you kept saying during the battle, that we'd earned time. Time to heal, time to build, time to figure out who we are, now that we're not running or hiding." Jackson thought about his father's words in the journal about building something lasting rather than just taking quick profit, about doing things the right way, even when it was harder. Thomas Cole had died before he could see his vision realized, but his son could finish what he'd started, could turn blood money into honest wealth, could build something good from all the pain and loss. There's going to be a ceremony next week, Sheriff Wardle had told him yesterday. Territory's sending a representative. They want to officially recognize what happened here. Maybe even offer you your marshal position back. Jackson had declined the latter. He'd worn the badge during the fight, and it had felt right in that moment. But he wasn't that man anymore. Wasn't sure he wanted to be. Now he wanted something smaller, more personal. A business to build with someone he trusted. A town to be part of rather than responsible for. A life that was his own rather than defined by obligation and duty. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Jackson looked at the new sign, at the town rebuilding around it, at the mountains rising behind them in eternal patience. "I'm thinking about my father's watch, how it kept ticking even when it was cracked, how time kept moving forward even when I thought I was standing still." He pulled the watch from his pocket and opened it. The mechanism ran true despite the damaged case, its steady tick, marking seconds into minutes, into hours, into a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than just survival. "I'm thinking," Jackson continued, "that maybe broken things can still work, can still serve their purpose, can still mark time for people who need to remember that the past doesn't have to define the future." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple gesture that spoke of trust and growing affection. "That's a pretty thought, Marshal." "Former Marshal," Jackson corrected. "Now, I'm just Jackson Cole, son of Thomas Cole, prospective business owner, protector of stubborn women who don't know when to quit. I could say the same about stubborn men who stand alone against armies." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, warming a day that had started cold. Around them, Timber Ridge continued its healing. Buildings were being repaired, families were returning, life was reasserting itself in the way it always did after violence passed. Doc Henley walked by and tipped his hat to them. "Looking better every day, both of you." "Thanks to you," Sarah replied. "Thanks to each other," Doc corrected. "I just patch bodies. You two patch something more important, each other's belief that good people still exist." He nodded toward the new sign. Catherine's words, but the sentiment fits. After he left, Jackson stood and offered Sarah his hand. She took it and rose beside him, both of them moving a little carefully, still healing but getting stronger every day. "Come on," Jackson said. "Let's go look at those survey maps of the claim. Figure out where we're going to build the operation." "Our operation," Sarah corrected. "Our operation," Jackson agreed. Partners. They walked toward the future together, two people who'd survived the worst and chosen to build something better. Behind them, the new sign caught the morning light, its message clear and simple. Here, good people had stood. Here, good people had fought. Here, good people had won. And now, here, good people would build. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Jackson's vest, marking time for a life that was just beginning. Some things he'd learned were worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth standing alone against impossible odds for. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you didn't have to stand alone at all.